great. And I think it's really interesting to hear the commonalities among your stories. I think that finding solidarity or sort of recognizing your experience in others is kind of an important part of the organizational, I don't know, that your involvement in organizations or what has drawn each of you to organizations. And one of the things that I'm most excited about the show being here in Chicago about is that you guys have one of the longest running women's organizations, women architects organizations in the country, in the world.
Sorry, maybe in the world, definitely in the country.
Definitely in the country. Yeah. And Susan, I know you've written a lot about that. So, I wonder if you can even give us a little bit of a background and talk about.
So one thing I want to read, and but maybe before I read it, I'll preface. So I mentioned the name. You mentioned the name of the chapter of this book is "Only Girl Architect Lonely," and maybe I'll just read this quick. First, the intro to that chapter is that only girl architect lonely wanted to meet all the women architects in Chicago to form a club. So read Elizabeth Martini's 1921 advertisement in a local newspaper. At that time, she was the only woman architect licensed in private practice in Illinois. Martini was not the first woman to practice architecture in the area, and her want ad underscores an overlooked chapter of Chicago architectural history. Women architects practicing and organizing here and there, as it is in the book. Indeed, Martini's want ad led to the organization of the Chicago Women's Drafting Club, which later became the Women's Architectural Club of Chicago, or WACC, and then in turn formed the antecedent of Chicago Women in Architecture, CWA, which was founded in the 1970s and I said it there, is one of the longest lasting associations of practicing women architects in the nation today. So I mentioned, I also like to say, like, if you'd asked me, given me one more minute to say what to put on my ad when you were or the bio, when you were putting together the invitation, I like to call myself an accidental historian because I'm an architect and I have a day job, but somehow I found myself over the years writing about women in architecture. And that really that was the first thing I did for Chicago Women in Architecture. I worked for their publication then. And that's what attracted me to or that's what I felt like I wanted to do for that organization. And it was through that series of articles that I wrote for them over probably, 5 to 10 years. And I also organized other women members also wrote the articles and I would just edit them. But that was what actually really gave me the basis for ending up being invited to write this chapter, because over that time I acquired all this history. And we had a long list. Like I found out about Elizabeth Martini and that she'd written this ad. And I'm like, that is so cool. But at that point in time, we knew nothing else about her then. And so writing this chapter for me was about kind of taking that list of women that I had discovered over the years and trying to see what I could find. And it was actually really, really hard. So it's really hard to uncover these histories. And then what was even more interesting about, and I don't know anything about I don't know anything about writing. Some people in the office or in the audience might laugh about that, but and I certainly don't know anything about how you publish something. And we were all done writing, and they were doing editing and all of that. And somebody finally gave me a box from Gertrude Purvis, who was the founder of Chicago Women in Architecture. And it might have been actually Gertrude may have given it to me and then told me she wanted me to make sure it got into the CWA archive, or it may have been Betty Blum. I can't remember. She's the oral historian for the Art Institute. But at any rate, I was done with this chapter. We were done. They were like doing final stuff. And I get this box that had all this more information from Gert, who when I started going through it, I was trying to make changes to the chapter and they wouldn't let me. They're like, no, you can't. So as this was coming out, I already felt like I could add to it, which was frustrating. So what I actually want to read to you, and then I think this might set up some other discussion, is one of the things that came in that box to me. And it was because it's about the founding of Chicago Women in Architecture. And so it was Gertrude Kurbis. There was an architecture magazine called Architecture Plus back then. It doesn't exist anymore. But another woman from Chicago named Bertha Whitman, wrote an opinion piece to the magazine, and then Gertrude took that and sent it with this letter I'm going to read you to the then president of AIA Chicago. So first I'm going to read you the article, and then I'm going to read her letter. I'm sorry, it's not even her letter. She sent a letter, and what I have is the letter from the president of AIA Chicago back to Gert. Okay, so I'm going to try and read fast. Women in architecture. I read Architecture Plus from cover to cover and can say with sincerity that it is the best architectural magazine I have ever seen. I have come to the conclusion that the reason for the excellence is the number of women associated with it. So again, this is 1973. I hope you may be able to tell me what to do with some historical material on women in architecture. Around 1921, the first licensed woman architect in Illinois formed a group of women in the Chicago area who were architects in it or associated with the profession. For years, we had a very strong club, and I have some of the brochures. I received my license in 1926, and I'm still practicing. There are 3 other women of that period also licensed and working. After about 1950, there were not so many women architects in Chicago, and it was hard to maintain a club. The AIA asked them to become a branch, and it deteriorated into nothing. The Chicago chapter is very chauvinistic and will barely speak to a woman architect. So this was, again, Bertha Whitman. She was, at that time, an architect practicing in Illinois, and she was primarily a residential architect. And so she's another one that somebody could dig in. I mean, her houses are probably scattered all over the north side. So Gertrude sends that with a letter, I guess, to the president of AIA Chicago. And so that was, some of you may know, it was Wilbert R. Halsbrook. At that time, he was the executive director of the Chicago chapter. So he was like Zurich Esposito back then. Okay, so this is dated December 4th, 1973. So he writes back to Gertrude. Dear Gertrude, my first reaction to the letter you pointed out to me in the Plus magazine from the lady architect from Chicago was one of amusement. Later, I spoke at some length with Cindy Weiss about women in architecture in particular, and decided that while the Plus letter was not exactly factual, it certainly pointed out a serious shortcoming of the Chicago chapter. We do literally nothing to encourage activity by our ladies in or out of the Chicago chapter. Furthermore, I would suspect that most young ladies entering college are probably discouraged, at least subliminally, to take subjects at least encouraged, at least subliminally, to take subjects other than architecture. I have reviewed our membership list and find that we have only 12 members in all categories who are not men. A rough guess would be that the chapter has about 45% of all registered architects in our area as members. I am certain that the percentage of male members who are eligible is far greater than female members. I cannot recall any effort by anyone to change this situation. Attached is a list of the members mentioned above. Do you have any thoughts of how we might suggest to this group that they form a core committee to demonstrate that women do perform at least equally to men, and that gets better, and that there is certainly room for them in the AIA? In most cases, I suspect that female architects must be superior to their male counterparts, or they wouldn't be working at all. All of the above merely points out that I recognize a problem. I offer no solution. If there is one, I welcome the opportunity to help implement it. Whatever is done, it will probably have to be done by people like yourself. I'm afraid my participation will have to be kept in the background, or it could well be that I could compound an already unfortunate situation. It will take a long time to see any real results, but if someone doesn't start now, it will take even longer. call me after you've thought about this. So all that we know is that that was December, and some of you in the room have seen in January, and maybe it's in the exhibit or it could be in the future. In January of that year, Gertrude Purvis sent a note out to all of the women, I'm sure that list and everyone else she knew, to come to her office to have a meeting, and that was the first meeting of CWA. So it takes a long time.
It does take a long time. And I think there's a lot to unpack there, like not just the loneliness of the first woman to put out that ad in the paper, but also the fact that, the alliance, that there was an attempt from the AIA leadership to address the issue within the core membership, and yet the desire to make a separate organization if one feels that there's maybe chauvinism in the core. And then also the lack of awareness about what has been done beforehand. And I think that kind of brings me maybe to, if we can zoom ahead to the future, which is, I think, Smitha and Veselka, you guys are kind of the faces of the future here, because you're the current present and future, because you're actually in these leadership positions. You probably didn't grow up reading correspondence from between leaders in Chicago history. So can you talk about, does history inform your practice at all, or do you sort of insist on working without it? Do you need history in any way?
Can I ask one thing?
Yes.
Can we turn the fans down? Like maybe these two right here? Is that possible?
Yes.
Sorry.
Is it possible to turn down
I'm very cold.
to turn down the fans? Yeah. Speaking of climate control.
Yeah.
I was like, it would be bad to leave and not say anything.
Yes, we are about speaking up here.
The thermostat patriarchy, so they say.
Sorry, but back to the question.
Yeah, just I want to know, did you know any history about, let's say either advocacy or organization building or discrimination or anything? Did history inform your practice as you took the leadership position of INOMA and CWA?
Okay. Well, INOMA has NOMA in general, the National Organization of Minority Architects, has a pretty strong history, specifically in Chicago. So when the organization started, it was a lot of members in Chicago and Detroit that ultimately came together to create the national organization. So I think, the funny thing is that I've really only been part of INOMA for about 8 months when I came into the presidency, and even in that time, I was very aware that this was an organization with an incredible amount of history, and I was very eager to learn that. As I mentioned earlier, the kind of diversity in age and background of the members of NOMA really made me curious about understanding where did the organization come from, what are all these different people coming from, when you're dealing with different forms of oppression in an industry and your day-to-day life, that really changes the perspective with which you'll move forward and interact with your career and with your community. And coming into a leadership role of an organization that had such a rich history, but also one that I didn't know much about, it immediately made me realize I have to take into account everything that's been done before. So a lot of our programming this year was actually around understanding the legacy of the organization and kind of bringing together the longstanding members to tell their stories, because whether that was, stories of casually having drinks after a meeting and how that propelled something great for the organization, or if it was about great movements that they did to kind of push forward the rights and opportunities of people of color throughout architecture in Chicago. And then further than that, as the organization grew, it was really important to me that maybe if I couldn't learn all the stories, that at least there was a clear intention to bring all that back to the surface, because we do have a lot of young members now. We do have people, it's very easy for us to not know all of the history that is there before, but it's so easy for us to know also. And so to me, I did not want to be, the person who comes in and just decides it's like this, because that looks terrible for any leader to just come in and address everything with no sense of context. So I think even though I didn't know the history, the knowledge that there is a history and a story to be told was really important and continues to be important to me in this role.
So you're activating the intergenerational nature of your membership,
Of course.
sort of drawing on the...
Because I think that dialogue is so important to hear from, your predecessors and the previous generations what they've gone through, because it's very easy to think that nothing's happening. It's very easy to approach your day-to-day life and think that we're in this terrible time, no changes happen, but it's that whole thing over and over again about change doesn't happen in a lifetime, and you can really only start to understand the impact that you're having when you get how your story fits into that larger picture.
And also burnout, I think, is real, right?
Yeah,
And
burnout is real.
Griselda, is this something that resonates with you? Do you
Yeah,
find, you have a long-standing organization as well. Do you find that there's an intergenerational dialogue happening, or do you think that it's about starting fresh?
I think it's a little bit of both. The organization's been around for about 45 years, and it's a pretty long time. So I had some pretty big shoes to fill. But just speaking to the older members of the foundation, because CWA tries to do a lot, right? We have scholarships, we have ARE incentives, we have a monthly forum, if not like 3 other events that month. We have these massive board meetings. We have some events have, over 80 people show up. We have a holiday party, a spring brunch. And just talking to the older generation, they kind of just met at a bookshop. Like they had coffee, they met at a bookshop, they talked about their projects.
They had power lunches, apparently.
Power lunches. And so we're like running around trying to like market, have these massive events. And it's like some of these smaller things are super important. And just like, some of the stuff Susan was showing me about how publications showcasing women architects in their work, like we don't see enough of that. Like, that's something our organization can help bridge, the gap between what's out there and, sort of just show, sort of advance the status of women architects, which is super important. But if you hear the stories, there's some of our members actually start working with other members. And then some of the older members that have been there, if they're looking for, to employ someone, they reach out to us first and we sort of get the word out. If there's we're starting to do this thing where if there's like an RFP, like the city of Chicago puts out this request for a proposal, like we'll hear from it and we'll let our members know. Because that's sometimes things that, women architects or the smaller firms don't know about. And a lot of these bigger companies don't really employ women firms because they don't have the manpower to sort of take these large projects. So it is important to sort of like start these new initiatives because there is a lot of room for improvement, but just those like coffee shop, like have coffee, meet new people, network is also really important. So I think going one way and trying to respect the history and sort of it's been around for 45 years. We're doing something right. So.
Yeah, I have to say that does to me sound like a sign of a healthy organization in both of your cases to have that intergenerational, to be able to have that dialogue. And